The mission began with excitement, pride, and a hint of arrogance. The commanders of the fleet stood in the central command room, staring at the holographic projection of a distant planet. On the screen, it looked quiet, almost unassuming. Blue and green orb floating in the darkness of space. Intelligence reports had labeled it a Class 15 Deathworld. The designation alone was enough to make most fleets hesitate, to make even the bravest officers rethink their plans. Yet these commanders believed themselves invincible. They had faced dangerous missions before. They had conquered worlds where others failed. And yet, the warnings about this planet barely fazed them. The first briefing was long and thorough. Analysts presented data collected from decades of remote observations, describing a world that was harsh, unpredictable, and incredibly lethal. Every living creature on the planet had evolved to survive in the extreme environment. The storms could tear apart entire cities, the wildlife could destroy machines designed for war, and the land itself was treacherous, shifting, and full of hidden dangers. But the commanders listened politely, nodded at the charts, and dismissed most of the cautionary notes. "We've handled dangerous missions before," one of them said. "Surely this is no different. We have the technology. We have the strategy. We have the fleet. Nothing can stop us." There was a collective sense of confidence, a belief that the planet might be difficult, but not impossible to conquer. No one truly understood just how wrong they were. Preparations for the invasion were meticulous. Ships were loaded with weapons, armor, and all manner of supplies. Recon units were briefed to explore the terrain, map the flora and fauna, and report back. Every officer had a role. Every soldier knew their orders. Even the youngest crew members felt a surge of pride, thinking they were about to make history. This was not going to be just another mission. This was going to be the mission that proved humanity's superiority across the galaxy. The fleet departed in a synchronized launch. The vast ships left the safety of their homeworld, one by one, cutting through the void of space like blades. The journey was long, but the commanders used the time to continue refining their strategy. They reviewed scans, studied ancient intelligence reports, and debated the best landing zones. Each plan was more ambitious than the last. Each scenario, assuming that the planet would be an obstacle, not a threat. When they finally arrived in orbit, the planet looked even more serene and deceivingly peaceful than it had in the scans. From space, it seemed almost beautiful. There were vast forests, sparkling lakes, and mountains that touched the clouds. There were no signs of civilization, no cities, no structures. It seemed quiet, almost lifeless. And that, the commanders thought, was proof of their coming success. How hard could it be to land, survey, and establish control on a world that seemed so empty? The first reconnaissance missions began immediately. Drones and small scout teams were sent down to the surface to gather more information. At first, everything appeared normal. The landscape was harsh, yes, but manageable. The wildlife was distant, mostly small creatures that seemed curious but harmless. The initial reports brought relief to the commanders. Perhaps, after all, they had overestimated the danger. Perhaps this planet was just a rough piece of land with no real threat. But that relief was short-lived. The scouts began reporting back. Unusual encounters. The smaller animals were not only aggressive, but strangely intelligent. They adapted to traps and weapons almost instantly. They were everywhere at once, appearing in unexpected places, disappearing just as quickly. Some scouts never returned, and the communications from the field grew tense and frantic. Yet the commanders still refused to believe the full extent of what they were hearing. "The planet is testing us," one officer suggested. "It's throwing obstacles at us, but nothing we can't handle." Others nodded, trying to maintain confidence, trying to keep morale high. They convinced themselves that any losses were normal, that every dangerous mission required sacrifice. But deep down, some began to feel a creeping unease, a sense that this planet was unlike anything they had faced before. Despite these early warnings, the fleet continued with its plan. Landing zones were chosen, squads were dispatched, and equipment was deployed. The first humans set foot on the planet's surface, marveling at its beauty while simultaneously feeling the sting of its dangers. The air was thick, the terrain uneven, and the weather unpredictable. Even the simplest steps required caution. And yet they pressed on, driven by ambition, pride, and a desire to prove themselves. As they explored further, the dangers became more evident. The land itself seemed alive, as if it was resisting intrusion. Hills collapsed without warning, rivers surged in unnatural floods, and storms appeared with terrifying suddenness. Creatures, some small, some massive, attacked in ways that were both terrifying and strategically brilliant. Every encounter left the soldiers shaken. Every close call made it clear that the planet was more than just a physical challenge. It was a force, a living ecosystem designed to survive and eliminate intruders. Back at the command center, the commanders began to receive more detailed reports from the field. Losses were higher than expected. Equipment was being destroyed faster than it could be replaced. Scouts described landscapes that changed overnight, predators that seemed almost invisible, and traps that were impossible to anticipate. Still, the commanders tried to maintain control, reassuring themselves that they were learning the planet's patterns, that with time they could master it. But the first signs of true fear were beginning to surface. Officers whispered about what they were facing. Soldiers returned from missions, exhausted and traumatized, speaking of the sheer intelligence of the wildlife and the terrifying unpredictability of the environment. Even the most seasoned veterans admitted they had never seen anything like it. And yet the fleet pressed on. Retreat was not an option. Pride, ambition, and a desire to conquer drove them forward. Even as the evidence mounted that they were walking into a trap, they could not escape. By the end of the first part of their mission, it was clear that this planet was not merely dangerous, it was lethal. It had survived for millennia without any interference, developing defenses that could outsmart even the most advanced technology. The commanders had thought themselves prepared, confident, and invincible. But as the sun set over the jagged horizon of the Deathworld, the first cracks in their confidence began to appear. For the first time, they truly understood that this mission was unlike any other. The planet was alive, aware, and deadly. It was not a land to be conquered. It was a force to be reckoned with. And as the shadows lengthened across the landscape, there was a growing sense of foreboding, a quiet but powerful realization that this mission might not end in triumph, but in disaster. The soldiers on the ground felt it too. Every step was cautious, every movement measured. The planet tested them in ways they had never imagined. And somewhere deep in their minds, the commanders began to wonder if their pride had blinded them to the most important lesson. Underestimating this world could cost them everything. The first day ended with quiet tension. The Deathworld seemed calm, almost peaceful, but beneath the surface, it was preparing, adapting, and waiting. The commanders thought they were leading an invasion. In reality, they had become part of an experiment, a challenge they were only beginning to comprehend. And so, the stage was set. The mission had begun with hope, excitement, and ambition. But the first signs of the planet's true danger were already appearing. The Deathworld was not just a place to conquer, it was a test of survival. And the humans, proud and confident, were only beginning to understand the rules of this deadly game. The planet did not wait for the humans to settle in before showing its power. At first, it seemed calm, even welcoming. The air was thick but breathable, the ground stable enough to walk on, and the sun cast a warm glow over the jagged landscapes. The first scouts had returned with positive reports, and the commanders, though still cautious, believed they were beginning to understand the planet. They thought they were adapting faster than it was. They thought they were in control. But the Deathworld had no intention of being controlled. The first encounter happened unexpectedly. A reconnaissance unit had been sent to survey a dense forest region that appeared on the maps as safe. The soldiers moved carefully, scanning the undergrowth and monitoring every sound. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. Birds called. From a distance, insects buzzed faintly, and a gentle wind rustled the leaves. But suddenly, the silence was shattered. From nowhere, massive claws tore through the foliage. The unit barely had time to react before several soldiers were caught in a flurry of movement, dragged into shadows and torn apart before anyone could understand what had happened. The first reports were garbled, filled with fear and confusion. The commanders in the orbiting fleet could barely comprehend what the scouts were describing. Creatures that should not have existed, according to the initial scans, had appeared. They were fast, intelligent, and terrifyingly coordinated. They attacked in small groups, using the terrain to their advantage, and seemed to anticipate the humans. Moves before they even acted, the surviving members of the unit returned, shaken and pale. Their weapons had barely scratched the attackers. They spoke of massive jaws, sharp claws, and bodies that blended perfectly with the surroundings. Every description contradicted the intelligence the commanders had received. The planet was more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Yet, the commanders were reluctant to admit it. They still believed that with the right strategy and firepower, they could overcome any challenge. The following days were worse. Small patrols were sent to other parts of the planet, and each returned with similar reports. One team encountered rivers that seemed calm, but hid violent currents capable sweeping away even the strongest swimmers. Another team reported forests, where the trees themselves appeared to move, branches swinging down to strike anyone who passed. Even the wildlife seemed to be working together, forming traps and ambushes that left soldiers disoriented and terrified as the losses mounted. The morale of the fleet began to crumble. Soldiers spoke in whispers about the planet's intelligence, as if it were a single living entity working against them. The commanders tried to maintain order, holding meetings and issuing new strategies, but their confidence was eroding. The reports painted a picture of a planet alive with deadly surprises, and no plan seemed to survive contact with its reality. One evening, during a debriefing, a scout who had survived an encounter with a massive predator described what happened. In a trembling voice, "It wasn't just hunting us," the scout said. "It was watching us, learning us, figuring out how we moved. Every time we tried to outsmart it, it was already one step ahead. It was almost smart, like it understood what we were thinking." The room fell silent. No one wanted to believe it, but the evidence was undeniable. The Deathworld was not just a dangerous environment. It was actively resisting them. Every attack, every move the humans made, seemed to be anticipated and countered. The commanders realized that they were no longer in charge. They were playing a game with an opponent that did not follow the usual rules of warfare. Desperate to regain control, the fleet began deploying heavier weapons. Artillery strikes were launched into the forests. Flamethrowers cleared swaths of terrain, and armored units were sent to confront the wildlife directly. At first, these tactics seemed effective. Several attacks succeeded, and some creatures were eliminated. The humans cheered, thinking they had finally gained an advantage. But the planet adapted. In places where forests were cleared, new predators appeared almost immediately. Rivers rerouted themselves, mudslides blocked paths, and even the weather seemed to change with purpose. It became clear that every action taken by the humans had a consequence, and the Deathworld responded in kind. The planet was not static. It was alive in a way that defied comprehension. One morning, a group of soldiers sent to survey a canyon disappeared entirely. The canyon had seemed safe, a simple passage through the mountains. But when the command center analyzed the data afterward, they discovered that the canyon had shifted overnight. Massive rock slides had created new tunnels, hidden crevices, and deadly traps. The soldiers were never found. The commanders had to face the terrifying possibility that the planet itself could reshape its terrain to trap intruders. Fear began to spread through the ranks. Soldiers were afraid to venture into even familiar areas. Each mission felt like a gamble with life and death. The first real panic started when a communication array reported a massive storm heading directly toward a base camp. The storm appeared suddenly, faster than predicted, and the wind shredded structures, tore power lines from the ground, and sent the unprepared soldiers running for cover. Even the advanced technology of the fleet could barely survive the onslaught. Commanders were forced to rethink their approach. Meetings were held to plan new strategies, to figure out how to regain control. Some suggested pulling back and reassessing, but the pride of the fleet would not allow it. Retreat was a word that did not exist in their vocabulary. Every suggestion involved finding a way to fight back, to prove that humanity could dominate. Even this deadly world docked meanwhile, the planet continued to assert its dominance. Nighttime was even more dangerous than the day. Predators emerged from shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly, hunting with precision and coordination. Soldiers reported hearing sounds that were almost intelligent growls that warned them, screeches that seemed to communicate with one another. Every time humans tried to use the cover of darkness to move safely, they found themselves ambushed. The planet was teaching them a lesson, one that no simulation or training could have prepared them for. Despite the mounting losses, the humans continued to explore, believing they could eventually master the environment. The commanders increased. Patrols sent more reinforcements and attempted to study the wildlife in more detail. But the more they observed, the more they realized how little they understood. The creatures were not predictable. Their behavior changed depending on the time of day, the terrain, and even the actions of the humans themselves. Communication between the units became a lifeline. Teams shared their observations, trying to warn others about hidden dangers. Stories of bravery and heroism emerged as soldiers risked their lives to save comrades. Yet every day brought news of those who did not return. The planet's lethality was relentless, and no human ingenuity could fully counter it. By the end of Part 2, the commanders were beginning to feel the first real cracks in their confidence. They had assumed the Deathworld would be difficult, but conquerable. They had believed that technology, strategy, and determination would allow them to succeed where others would fail. But the reality was different. The planet was alive, intelligent, and unforgiving. Every step taken by the humans was met with resistance. Every attempt to control the environment seemed to backfire. The soldiers on the ground were exhausted, fearful, and frustrated. The Deathworld had already claimed lives, equipment, and morale. Even those who survived felt a constant sense of dread, knowing that danger lurked around every corner, often in forms they could not even see. The confidence that had carried them to this point was fading, replaced by a creeping understanding that the planet was not just a place to conquer. It was a force they might never overcome. And so, the stage was set for the next phase of the mission. The humans were learning, slowly and painfully, that the Class 15 Deathworld was not simply an environment. It was a living, adaptive, and terrifying opponent. Every encounter, every loss, and every narrow escape brought a single, undeniable lesson. They had underestimated the planet. By the time the second part of the mission ended, the commanders finally began to understand a truth they had refused to see at first. The Deathworld was not just dangerous. It was designed to survive and eliminate any threat. The humans had entered its domain thinking they were the hunters, but slowly, painfully, they were becoming the hunted. The first real losses hit the fleet harder than anyone could have imagined. Until now, the soldiers had faced danger and survived, often by luck or skill. They had encountered aggressive creatures, unpredictable terrain, and harsh weather. But nothing had prepared them for the scale of the devastation that was about to come. It began with a patrol that had been sent to secure a ridge overlooking one of the rivers. The ridge was supposed to be safe, a vantage point where the soldiers could set up observation posts and report back about nearby movements. They moved carefully, scanning the terrain, setting up cameras and sensors, and checking each other's equipment. At first, everything seemed normal. The ridge was quiet, the river below calm, and the creatures distant. Then the attack came. From the surrounding forests and cliffs, creatures emerged in a coordinated strike, unlike anything the soldiers had seen before. They moved quickly, silently, and with frightening intelligence. The patrol tried to fight back, but the attackers were fast, powerful, and relentless. They struck with precision, targeting weak points in armor, cutting off retreat paths and separating the soldiers from one another. Within minutes, the ridge had become a trap. Communications back to the command center were frantic. The soldiers shouted over static, warning others to avoid the area. But the connection was weak, and soon the line went silent. By the time reinforcements arrived, the ridge had been overrun. Only a handful of the patrol survived, injured and terrified. They spoke of creatures they had never imagined, some as big as vehicles, others small but deadly, all working together in a way that suggested intelligence beyond instinct. The commanders in the fleet were shaken. They had expected some losses, but not like this. Not so sudden, so coordinated, so complete. The reality of the planet's danger was beginning to sink in. It was no longer just harsh terrain or aggressive wildlife. It was a living, adaptive ecosystem designed to eliminate intruders. Every attempt to push forward had consequences, and every encounter was teaching the humans just how lethal the Deathworld could be. Following the Ridge disaster, the fleet attempted to regroup. Soldiers were sent to retrieve the survivors and recover equipment, but the planet seemed to anticipate every move. The terrain shifted, rivers rose unexpectedly, and even creatures that had been seen before appeared in new formations, cutting off retreat paths. The Deathworld was learning, adapting, and countering the humans' actions in ways that were impossible to predict. Back at the command center, the commanders reviewed every report, every video feed, every sensor reading. They began to see patterns subtle, changes in terrain, unusual movement of wildlife, and sudden environmental shifts. It was as if the planet itself was alive and aware, watching every human, studying every tactic, and adjusting to ensure the intruders could not survive. The commanders tried to maintain composure, but even they could not hide the growing fear. Meanwhile, the soldiers on the ground were facing constant pressure. Every mission, every patrol, was a gamble with life and death. Communication was often delayed, and backup could arrive too late to save anyone. Teams learned to rely on each other, developing unspoken coordination and trust. Some soldiers risked their lives to drag wounded comrades to safety, showing courage and determination despite the overwhelming danger. These acts of bravery were inspiring, but they could not change the fact that the Deathworld was claiming lives at an alarming rate. One particularly harrowing encounter occurred in a valley where a unit had been sent to gather resources. The valley seemed peaceful at first, with rolling hills and a small river running through it. But as the soldiers moved deeper, the valley changed. Massive roots burst from the ground, wrapping around ankles, arms, and equipment. Creatures ambushed. From above and below, striking in perfect coordination. The soldiers fought valiantly, using every weapon they had, but one by one they were overpowered. Only a few escaped, and even they were badly injured. The valley had become a tomb. These losses had a profound effect on morale. Soldiers began to speak openly about fear, about doubts, about the possibility that they might not survive. The commanders tried to maintain order, reminding everyone of their mission, their training, and their duty. But the truth was undeniable. The planet was not just dangerous, it was overwhelming. The humans were no longer the hunters. They were the prey, struggling to survive against a force they could not fully comprehend. Attempts to adapt were met with more challenges. The fleet sent advanced machines to survey and map the terrain, hoping technology could give them an edge. Drones and automated sensors were deployed to track movements, record encounters, and predict environmental changes. For a short time, these tools provided valuable information. Patterns were noted and strategies adjusted. But the planet continued to evolve. Predators avoided traps, rivers changed course, and even the weather seemed to respond to human activity. Every advantage gained was temporary, and the humans were learning that brute force and technology alone could not guarantee survival. The commanders began to understand the magnitude of their mistake. They had underestimated the Deathworld. They had assumed that skill, planning, and equipment would be enough. They had assumed the planet could be studied, understood, and conquered. But the losses were proving otherwise. Every mission ended with survivors scarred, exhausted, and traumatized. Every encounter left a reminder of the Deathworld's intelligence and lethality. Fear was now a constant companion for the soldiers. Sleep was restless. Meals were eaten in silence, and every noise, shadow, or sudden movement triggered tension. Even the bravest among them admitted to nightmares and anxiety. Yet despite this, they pressed on, driven by duty, pride, and the hope that the next strategy would succeed. Every day was a battle, not just against the planet, but against their own fear. In the command center, the commanders debated their options. Some suggested retreat, but the pride of the fleet would not allow it. Others proposed new strategies, more careful patrols, and improved defenses. Each plan was cautious, each attempt measured, yet even the smallest action seemed to be met with resistance by the planet itself. The Deathworld was teaching them a lesson. Survival required more than weapons, skill, or courage. It required understanding, patience, and respect. One particularly tense moment came when a small scouting team discovered what they thought was an abandoned cave system. The team entered cautiously, hoping to find shelter and resources. But inside, the cave was anything but empty. Creatures had set traps, moved rocks, and created ambush points that the humans could not detect. Within moments, the team was under attack. Communication was frantic, weapons fired in every direction, but the creatures were precise, coordinated, and relentless. Only one member escaped to tell the tale, shaken, bleeding, and barely able to speak. The cave system became another grave, and the lesson was clear. No place on the planet was safe. By the end of Part 3, the humans had lost more than equipment and territory. They had lost confidence, certainty, and the illusion of control. They had learned that the Deathworld was not just an environment. It was a living, intelligent adversary that could outmaneuver, outthink, and overpower them at every turn. The scale of the losses forced the commanders to face a new reality. Their mission was no longer about conquest. It was about survival. The soldiers on the ground were exhausted, battered, and traumatized. Yet, even in the face of overwhelming danger, they displayed courage, loyalty, and ingenuity. They learned to work together, to adapt quickly, and to respect the power of the Deathworld. Every narrow escape, every rescued comrade, and every small victory was a reminder that survival was possible, but it required constant vigilance and humility. The stage was set for the next phase of the mission. The humans had learned painfully that the planet would not be conquered through strength alone. They would need new strategies, sharper instincts, and deeper understanding. The Deathworld had claimed its first real victories, but it had also taught the humans the value of caution, teamwork, and respect. The first real losses had changed everything. Pride had given way to fear. Confidence had given way to uncertainty. But even as the humans reeled from their experiences, they remained determined to continue. Survival was no longer guaranteed, but it was still possible. And the lesson they would carry forward was clear. Underestimate the Deathworld at your peril, for it had already proven that it could destroy even the most prepared and determined invaders. By now, the commanders could no longer ignore the truth. The losses had mounted, the missions had become deadly, and the reports from the field painted a picture they could no longer dismiss. The Class 15 Deathworld was not just dangerous, it was unlike anything they had faced before. Every encounter, every ambush, every shift in terrain was teaching them a harsh, unshakable lesson. The realization came slowly at first. The commanders had always prided themselves on their ability to analyze and control situations. They believed that with enough data, planning, and firepower, any challenge could be overcome. But now, as they sat in the command center reviewing sensor logs, casualty reports, and video footage, it became painfully clear that this planet was beyond control. Every video showed patterns of adaptation. Creatures that had been defeated in one encounter returned stronger or in greater numbers the next. Terrain that seemed safe yesterday was now filled with hidden traps. Even the weather seemed purposeful, with sudden storms, flooding, and shifting winds that appeared to anticipate human movements. It was no longer a question of danger. It was a question of intelligence. The planet itself was learning. The first moment of full understanding came during a detailed review of a reconnaissance mission. A unit had been sent to explore a valley that appeared safe on the maps. The team had noted unusual tracks and minor hazards, but nothing that seemed insurmountable. Yet when the footage was analyzed in detail, the commanders saw something terrifying. The valley had changed over the course of hours. Rock formations had shifted. Trees had fallen to create barriers. Predators had moved strategically, forming ambushes at every choke point. It was as if the planet had observed the humans and rearranged itself to trap them. The room went silent. No one spoke at first. The commanders, the people who had planned countless missions and led fleets to victory, sat in disbelief. The planet was alive in a way they had never imagined. It was not only dangerous, it was calculating, adaptive, and relentless. Every action they had taken had been anticipated and countered. The arrogance that had brought them here was crumbling. Under the weight of reality, the soldiers on the ground were beginning to feel the same truth, though in a different way. Each patrol, each encounter, made them more cautious, more aware, more fearful. Even the most experienced fighters were learning that brute force alone could not guarantee survival. The creatures were clever, unpredictable, and terrifyingly efficient. Every escape was narrow, every victory temporary, and every death a brutal reminder that the planet did not play by any known rules. The commanders debated their next move. They could not retreat, not yet. The fleet's pride, the expectations of their homeworld, and the belief that they could succeed, no matter what prevented them from considering withdrawal. They had to find a way to survive, to adapt, and to turn the tide. Plans were drawn and redrawn. Strategies were debated endlessly. Every scenario assumed that they could still master the Deathworld. But deep down, everyone knew that the planet was the true master. The first attempt at adaptation came in the form of defensive perimeters. Soldiers built fortified camps, using technology and terrain to create barriers. They set up sensors to detect movement, traps to catch predators, and patrols to maintain a constant watch. For a while, it seemed to work. Encounters were less deadly, and small victories gave hope that perhaps humans could find a way to survive. But the Deathworld had other plans. Within days, even the most secure camps were tested. Creatures found weaknesses in the defenses, rivers flooded unexpected areas, and even the landscape itself shifted to remove cover or expose the soldiers. The planet was teaching them a lesson that could not be learned in simulations or planning. Rooms. Survival required humility, observation, and constant awareness. The humans were no longer in control. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers began to speak openly about fear, about the constant tension that made even the simplest tasks exhausting. Sleep was restless, meals were eaten in silence, and every sound triggered suspicion and anxiety. Even the commanders, who had once been confident and unshakable, began to show signs of stress. They understood now that the Deathworld was not just an opponent. It was a force that could outthink and outmaneuver them at every turn. One of the most shocking realizations came when a unit returned with footage of a predator encounter that should have been impossible to survive. The creatures attacked in perfect coordination, using the terrain to their advantage, avoiding traps and countering. Every weapon fired at them. It was as if they had studied the humans and anticipated every move. The soldiers on the team had barely escaped, but the lesson was clear. The Deathworld was not acting randomly. It was strategic, intelligent, and deadly. The commanders held emergency meetings to discuss the implications. Retreat was whispered about in private, though no one dared suggest it openly. Instead, they focused on new strategies. More careful patrols, enhanced sensors, and defensive fortifications. They attempted to study the planet's patterns, to predict its behavior, and to adapt their tactics accordingly. Each plan required constant vigilance and precise execution. Mistakes were no longer minor, they were fatal. Meanwhile, the soldiers on the ground adapted in their own ways. They learned to move silently, to read subtle signs of danger, and to watch both the environment and the creatures carefully. They developed signals and communication methods that allowed them to coordinate in moments of chaos. Every small adaptation increased their chance of survival, though it did not eliminate danger. The planet remained a formidable adversary, always observing, always learning. One particularly harrowing incident involved a supply convoy sent to reinforce a forward camp. The convoy traveled cautiously, using sensors and scouts to avoid hazards. Yet when they reached a seemingly safe pass, the terrain shifted unexpectedly. Rocks fell from cliffs, blocking the path and forcing the vehicles into a narrow corridor. Predators emerged from the shadows, attacking with precision. Despite their best efforts, several vehicles were destroyed, and personnel were injured or killed. The survivors barely escaped, leaving behind equipment and supplies. The commanders could no longer ignore the truth the Deathworld controlled. The battlefield, not them. The full realization settled like a weight on the fleet. They had underestimated the planet. They had assumed intelligence, planning, and technology would be enough. But every loss, every failed mission, and every narrow escape had proven otherwise. The Deathworld was not simply an environment to conquer. It was a living, intelligent, and lethal force. In private, some commanders admitted fear for the first time. They acknowledged that the planet might be unbeatable, that their pride had led them into a situation they could not dominate. But publicly, they maintained order, issued commands, and urged the soldiers to continue. Survival depended on discipline, teamwork, and adaptation. The lesson was clear. Respect the Deathworld, learn from it, and never underestimate it again. By the end of this phase, the humans had learned more than they ever expected. The Deathworld was alive, intelligent, and unforgiving. It was not merely a place of danger. It was an opponent that could adapt, anticipate, and outmaneuver them. Every step forward had consequences. Every action was met with a response, and every victory was temporary. Yet, even in the face of overwhelming odds, the humans persisted. Soldiers displayed courage, ingenuity, and determination. They learned to move carefully, to anticipate threats, and to rely on one another. Every narrow escape, every small victory, and every rescued comrade reinforced the understanding that survival was possible, but only through observation, adaptation, and respect for the planet. The first real realization of the planet's intelligence changed everything. The mission was no longer about conquest. It was about survival. The humans had been humbled, forced to see themselves not as masters, but as students of a world far older, wiser, and deadlier than they could have imagined. By the close of Part 4, the Deathworld had claimed both physical and psychological victories. The commanders and soldiers understood the truth fully. This was not a planet to be fought and conquered. It was a force to be understood, respected, and survived. And even as they planned their next steps, they knew that every decision would have to be measured, cautious, and adaptive, because the planet was always watching, always learning, and always ready to strike. By the time the fifth phase of the mission began, desperation had become the most common emotion among the humans on the Deathworld. The soldiers were exhausted, the fleet's resources were dwindling, and the commanders faced the harsh reality that traditional strategies were no longer effective. Every attempt to control the terrain, every effort to fight back, was met with immediate and often deadly resistance. The planet had proven itself intelligent, adaptive, and relentless, and the humans had no choice but to rethink everything they had learned so far. The first step was survival. The soldiers on the ground were no longer moving with the confidence of seasoned invaders. Each patrol was cautious, slow, and deliberate. Every step was measured, every movement observed, and every action weighed against potential risk. The landscape itself seemed to resist them, with cliffs that crumbled unexpectedly, rivers that surged without warning, and forests that concealed. Predators perfectly adapted to the humans' tactics. The commanders began experimenting with unconventional methods. Instead of trying to dominate the planet, they focused on learning from it. Scouts were deployed not just to gather intelligence, but to observe patterns, how creatures moved, how the environment shifted, and how weather events could be predicted. Soldiers were trained to watch subtle signs, a change in wind direction, a sudden rustling of leaves, or faint tracks that hinted at nearby predators. It was a new kind of warfare, one that required patience, observation, and constant adaptation. Even with these changes, losses continued. One patrol, attempting to map a canyon network, was ambushed by predators that appeared almost invisible against the rocks. The soldiers fought fiercely, using every weapon available, but the creatures were precise, coordinated, and relentless. Several were killed, and the survivors returned with injuries and exhaustion written on their faces. Every encounter left the humans more cautious and more aware of the sea of Deathworld's intelligence. The weather became another unpredictable adversary. Storms that had seemed random were now understood to be part of the planet's defensive system. Sudden floods washed away supplies and vehicles, while lightning strikes destroyed critical equipment. The humans realized that the environment itself was a weapon, and adapting to it became as important as defending against predators. The Deathworld was teaching a lesson that no training could prepare them for. Survival required respect, observation, and flexibility. The commanders began implementing defensive perimeters in a more sophisticated way. Instead of relying solely on technology, they integrated the natural terrain into their plans. Camps were built in sheltered valleys. Patrols were routed along safer paths, and observation posts were established on high ground to anticipate threats. Yet even these measures were only partially effective. Predators adapted, terrain shifted, and storms continued to strike unexpectedly. Every advantage gained was temporary, reminding the humans that nothing on this planet was permanent or predictable. In one particularly tense encounter, a team was sent to establish a supply route between two camps. The path seemed straightforward, but the terrain had other ideas. Massive landslides blocked the route, while predators emerged from hidden crevices to ambush the soldiers. Communication was limited, and backup arrived too late to prevent casualties. The survivors returned battered, carrying not just injuries, but a deep understanding of the Deathworld's cunning. Every decision, every movement could have consequences, and the humans were learning to respect that reality in a way that was both painful and necessary. Morale was fragile. Soldiers spoke openly about fear, anxiety, and exhaustion. Sleep was restless, and moments of respite were brief and tense. The commanders tried to maintain discipline and order, but even they could not hide the stress and worry that weighed heavily on the entire fleet. Yet despite this, the humans continued to fight, adapt, and survive. Acts of bravery and ingenuity emerged daily, from small tactical victories to clever strategies that allowed patrols to escape deadly ambushes. These moments reminded everyone that survival was still possible, even in the face of overwhelming danger. One creative strategy involved using the planet's own patterns against it. Soldiers observed the behavior of predators and environmental changes over time, noting rhythms and tendencies. They began to set traps that relied on these patterns, luring creatures into confined areas where they could be neutralized or driven away. While not perfect, this approach allowed small victories and gave the humans a sense of control, however temporary it might be. Each success was a lesson in patience, observation, and adaptation. The commanders also experimented with technology in new ways. Instead of relying solely on brute force, they developed sensors that could anticipate environmental shifts, alerting soldiers to approaching storms or moving predators. Drones were used not only for reconnaissance, but to distract or confuse the planet's creatures. These technological adaptations, combined with careful observation and strategic planning, allowed the humans to regain some sense of agency. Yet the Deathworld remained unpredictable, proving that no single strategy could guarantee survival. Despite the careful planning and adaptation, the planet continued to push back. Rivers changed course overnight, cliffs crumbled without warning, and storms struck in ways that defied prediction. Predators evolved in response to the humans' actions, avoiding traps and altering their hunting strategies. The Deathworld was a living, adaptive system, one that punished mistakes swiftly and relentlessly. Each encounter reinforced the lesson that survival required humility, observation, and respect for the planet's intelligence. The psychological strain on the humans was immense. Soldiers developed routines to cope with fear and exhaustion, from mindfulness exercises to careful monitoring of each other's well-being. The bond between team members grew stronger, forged through shared danger and the necessity of relying on one another. Acts of courage and ingenuity became crucial, not just for survival, but for maintaining morale and cohesion within the fleet. One particularly harrowing incident involved a forward team trapped in a dense forest during a sudden storm. The wind tore through the trees, the rain flooded the ground, and predators took advantage of the chaos. The soldiers worked together, using every skill and resource at their disposal to navigate the forest and reach safety. They suffered injuries and lost equipment, but they survived. This incident became a story of resilience and determination, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, humans could adapt and endure. The commanders watched closely, learning from every encounter. They began to appreciate the planet's intelligence in ways they had never imagined. The Deathworld was not a mindless adversary. It was adaptive, responsive, and relentless. It tested the humans at every turn, forcing them to think creatively, act cautiously, and respect the environment in ways that went far beyond traditional warfare. As the mission continued, the humans developed a new understanding of the Deathworld. They learned to anticipate threats, to observe patterns, and to adapt quickly. They discovered that survival was possible, but it required constant vigilance, teamwork, and a willingness to learn from both mistakes and successes. Every narrow escape, every small victory, and every act of ingenuity reinforced the lesson that the Deathworld could be respected, but never underestimated. By the end of Part 5, the humans had transformed. They were no longer the confident, arrogant invaders who had first landed on the planet. They were cautious, observant, and adaptive, constantly learning from the environment and the creatures that inhabited it. The Deathworld had forced them to evolve in their thinking, strategy, and approach to survival. The stage was now set for the final phase. The humans had faced immense challenges, suffered losses, and learned the planet's lessons in the harshest ways possible. They had survived attacks, adapted to unpredictable terrain, and developed strategies that allowed them to endure. But the Deathworld remained formidable, unpredictable, and intelligent. Every decision, every movement, and every plan would be tested again in the coming phase. The humans knew that the final challenge was not just about survival. It was about understanding the planet, respecting its power, and working together as never before. The Deathworld had forced them to change, to think differently, and to adapt constantly. And even as they prepared for the next phase, they understood that the planet's intelligence and unpredictability would continue to test them until the very end. Survival had become a battle of observation, adaptation, and ingenuity. The humans had learned to respect the Deathworld, to anticipate its actions, and to work together under extreme pressure. Every small success was hard-earned, and every failure carried consequences. The experience had changed them, leaving no room for arrogance or overconfidence. By the close of Part 5, the humans had become a different kind of Force One that survived not through domination, but through careful observation, quick adaptation, and unwavering teamwork. They had learned the Deathworld's lessons in the most difficult way possible, through trial, error, and resilience. And as they prepared for the final phase, they knew that every decision, every action, and every choice could determine whether they survived or fell victim to the planet's relentless intelligence. By the time the final phase of the mission began, the humans had learned more than they ever imagined possible. They had survived attacks, adapted to the terrain, and developed strategies to endure the Deathworld's relentless challenges. But the lessons of the planet had also been harsh. They had lost comrades, equipment, and confidence along the way. Pride had been replaced with caution, arrogance with respect, and certainty with the understanding that survival was never guaranteed. The commanders gathered in the central command room, analyzing the situation for what felt like the 100th time. They had reviewed every patrol report, every casualty log, and every piece of sensor data. The truth was unavoidable. The Deathworld was more than a dangerous environment. It was intelligent, adaptive, and relentless. It had observed their strategies, tested their reactions, and forced them to change in ways they had never anticipated. Even now, the planet was responding to their movements, reshaping the terrain, and shifting the balance of every encounter. The soldiers on the ground felt the weight of this reality more acutely than anyone else. Every mission required careful planning, observation, and quick thinking. Every step carried risk. The terrain shifted unexpectedly. Rivers flooded, and predators appeared where none had been seen before. Every patrol returned with injuries, equipment losses, or harrowing stories of near-death encounters. The humans were beginning to understand that no victory could be permanent. The first engagement of the final phase tested everything they had learned. A reconnaissance team had been sent to map a canyon that appeared to offer a safe passage to the next forward camp. They moved cautiously, using all the knowledge and strategies they had acquired over months on the planet. They watched for predators, checked for unstable terrain, and monitored environmental patterns. For a while, it seemed to work. The canyon appeared quiet and progress was steady, but then the Deathworld struck. Rocks fell from cliffs above, suddenly blocking the path. Hidden predators ambushed the team from multiple directions. Even the weather seemed to shift deliberately, with sudden wind gusts and rain that made footing treacherous. The soldiers fought back, using every tactic and piece of equipment available, but the planet had anticipated their moves. Every attack was countered, every escape route limited, and every advantage minimized. The team was forced to retreat under heavy fire, leaving behind supplies and equipment that the commanders in orbit were shaken. They realized that the Deathworld was not merely responding, it was predicting. The planet had learned from their strategies, adapting faster than they could. Every maneuver had consequences, every decision carried risk, and even their most carefully executed plans could fail. The humans were no longer operating on their own terms. The Deathworld had become the master of the battlefield. Back on the surface, the soldiers faced another challenge: exhaustion. Months of survival, adaptation, and constant vigilance had taken a toll. Injuries, fatigue, and stress weighed heavily on every team. Sleep was minimal and disrupted by fear and nightmares. Even the most experienced soldiers admitted they were afraid, and fear was now as much a part of the mission as strategy or equipment. Yet they pressed on, driven by the necessity of survival, the bond with their comrades, and the hope that they could endure another day. The fleet attempted to regain control by deploying new tactics. They combined technology, observation, and careful coordination to anticipate the planet's responses. Drones scouted ahead, sensors monitored environmental changes, and teams moved with precise timing. For brief moments, these tactics worked. Patrols returned with minor successes, and small areas were secured for short periods. But the Deathworld was relentless. Every success was temporary, and every minor victory was a reminder of how fragile human control truly was. Dangerous moments came when a supply convoy was sent to reinforce a forward camp. The convoy was heavily guarded, moving carefully along mapped routes. For a while, everything went smoothly. But the terrain shifted suddenly, as if the planet itself had moved. Rivers flooded, blocking the path, while predators attacked from the shadows. Vehicles were destroyed, supplies lost, and soldiers injured or killed. The survivors returned to the camp, exhausted and shaken, carrying a painful reminder of the Deathworld's intelligence and adaptability. The psychological toll on the humans was immense. Soldiers developed coping routines, relying on each other for support and morale. Teams learned to trust instincts, observe subtle signs of danger, and adapt quickly to unexpected changes. Every decision carried weight, every action required vigilance, and every encounter could be fatal. Yet despite the fear, exhaustion, and losses, the humans continued to fight, adapt, and survive. Their determination was a testament to resilience. In the face of overwhelming odds, the commanders, meanwhile, were forced to confront the ultimate reality. They had assumed they could dominate the Deathworld. They had believed that strategy, planning, and firepower were enough. But the planet had proven otherwise. It had claimed lives, destroyed equipment, and outmaneuvered every tactic. The humans were not in control. The Deathworld was. One particularly sobering moment came when a forward scouting team returned with detailed footage of a predator encounter. The creatures moved with incredible coordination, using the terrain, the environment, and their own instincts to isolate and overwhelm the humans. Even the most experienced soldiers were caught off guard. The team barely escaped with their lives, and the footage confirmed what everyone had suspected. The planet had become the dominant force, and human control was an illusion. The commanders realized that survival, not conquest, was the only goal. Every plan had to account for the Deathworld's intelligence, adaptability, and unpredictability. Retreat, careful movement, observation, and teamwork became paramount. The humans could no longer rely on force alone. They had to anticipate, adapt, and respect the planet's power. Every success was fragile, and every mistake could be fatal. The final days of the mission were a test of human ingenuity, endurance, and resilience. Soldiers moved with caution, relying on every lesson learned over months on the planet. Patrols were small, deliberate, and highly coordinated. Defensive perimeters were reinforced, and observation posts were carefully maintained. Technology was used strategically to predict environmental changes and track predators. Every measure was aimed at survival rather than conquest, yet the Deathworld continued to challenge them. Terrain shifted unexpectedly, predators attacked with precision, and weather events struck without warning. Every action the humans took was met with adaptation or resistance. The planet had proven itself to be a living, intelligent adversary that could outthink, outmaneuver, and overpower them at every turn. Survival required constant vigilance, teamwork, and respect for the environment. By the end of the mission, the humans had changed profoundly. They were no longer confident invaders. They were cautious observers, adaptive strategists, and resilient survivors. Every narrow escape, every small victory, and every lesson learned had shaped them into a force capable of enduring the Deathworld's relentless intelligence. Pride had given way to humility, arrogance to respect, and certainty to careful observation. Final realization came as the fleet prepared to withdraw. The commanders gathered their remaining forces, accounting for every loss, every injury, and every success. They understood fully that the Deathworld had won the battle, at least in terms of dominance. Humans had survived, yes, but only through adaptation, observation, and respect. The planet had taught them lessons that could not be ignored. Underestimating its intelligence was fatal, and survival required constant vigilance. As the humans left the surface, they carried more than injuries and loss. They carried knowledge, experience, and a profound respect for the power of the Deathworld. They understood that the planet was not just a place of danger. It was a living, adaptive, and intelligent force that could overcome even the most prepared invaders. The mission had been a trial, a test of human ingenuity, endurance, and humility. Soldiers and commanders knew that their experience would shape future missions, strategies, and approaches to unknown worlds. They had learned that survival depended not on domination, but on observation, adaptation, and teamwork. The Deathworld had proven itself to be a teacher, a master, and an opponent that could never be underestimated. By the end of Part 6, the humans had survived, but they had been humbled. The Deathworld had won in ways that were subtle, intelligent, and relentless. Every loss, every ambush, every challenge had reinforced the lesson that intelligence, adaptability, and respect for the environment were more powerful than technology, strategy, or force alone. The story of the mission would be remembered not for victory, but for survival. The humans had entered the Deathworld believing they could conquer it. They had left knowing they had been tested, challenged, and changed forever. The commanders finally understood the full power of a Class 15 Deathworld. It was not simply a planet to fight, it was a force to respect, study, and survive. And as the fleet departed, leaving the planet behind, there was a quiet acknowledgement. Among the humans, they had survived the impossible, learned the hard lessons, and gained wisdom that would shape humanity's understanding of the galaxy for generations to come. The